April 16, 1945. Honshu Airspace, Empire of Japan. The morning sun climbed above the eastern horizon as 57 North American P-51D Mustangs of the 45th Fighter Squadron, 15th Fighter Group approached their unprecedented target. In the lead aircraft, Major Robert W. Todd adjusted his oxygen mask and checked his fuel gauges one final time. His 6 wing-mounted .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns were loaded with a mixture of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds, 1,880 rounds total, enough firepower to shatter the illusion of Japanese invincibility. Below him stretched the sacred heartland of Japan, a landscape of terraced rice fields, ancient temples, and industrial cities that no American single-engine fighter was supposed to reach. The mission had been deemed impossible just 18 months earlier: escort B-29 superfortresses to targets deep within Japan from Iwo Jima, a volcanic speck in the Pacific Ocean 675 miles away. The sheer audacity of the undertaking would have been laughable to military planners in 1943, when the maximum combat radius of any fighter aircraft was measured in hundreds, not thousands, of miles. Yet here they were, American pilots flying deeper into enemy territory than any single-engine fighter had ever ventured, their silver Mustangs gleaming like avenging angels in the crystal-clear morning sky. At exactly 0830 hours, Japanese radar operators at coastal stations began frantically calling their headquarters. What they reported defied belief and sent shockwaves through the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service chain of command. Single-engine American fighters, not the familiar twin-engine Navy Hellcats from carrier raids, but Army Air Force Mustangs that should have been confined to airfields thousands of miles away, were penetrating Japanese airspace with the confidence of aircraft operating over their home territory. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. If American fighters could appear over Japan itself, what hope remained for the Empire's defense? The strategic situation in April 1945 had placed Japan in an impossible position. The capture of Iwo Jima by American forces just weeks earlier had positioned the United States Army Air Forces within striking distance of the Japanese home islands with their most potent weapon. The North American P-51D Mustang, the fighter that had swept the Luftwaffe from European skies, and was now preparing to do the same to Japanese air power. Major Moore, the future leading ace of the 7th Air Force with 12 confirmed victories, understood the broader implications better than most. The 25-year-old pilot had witnessed how long-range fighter escorts transformed strategic bombing from costly failure to overwhelming success. Now, as he led his formation toward Kanoya Air Base on Kyushu, he was demonstrating that the same principles applied in the Pacific theater. The mission planners at 7th Fighter Command Headquarters on Iwo Jima had been working toward this moment since the first P-51s arrived on the volcanic island in March. Brigadier General Ernest Mickey Moore had overseen the construction of necessary infrastructure and pilot training for very long-range operations. These missions pushed both men and machines to absolute limits, requiring pilots to remain in cramped cockpits for 8 hours while navigating across featureless ocean to targets defended by an enemy fighting for its homeland. The stakes could not have been higher. Success would mean American fighters could escort B-29s anywhere over Japan, enabling precision daylight bombing that would systematically destroy Japan's war-making capacity. Failure would leave the superfortresses vulnerable to Japanese interceptors and potentially prolong the Pacific War by months or years. For the Japanese, the appearance of American fighters over their homeland represented the collapse of their fundamental defensive strategy, which had relied on the Pacific Ocean itself as an insurmountable barrier protecting the sacred soil of Japan. The aircraft approaching Japan that April morning represented the pinnacle of American wartime aviation engineering and industrial production. Each P-51D rolling off North American aviation's production lines in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, embodied design principles perfected through 3 years of combat evolution and supported by the world's most advanced manufacturing infrastructure. The heart of the Mustang's superiority lay in its Packard V1657 engine, an American-licensed version of the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin 66. This liquid-cooled, supercharged power plant delivered 1,695 horsepower at takeoff, rising to 1,720 horsepower under war emergency power settings. The two-stage, two-speed supercharger system allowed the engine to maintain peak performance at altitudes where Japanese radial engines gasped for oxygen. At 25,000 feet, where most interceptions occurred, the P-51D could cruise at 380 miles per hour and sprint to 440 miles per hour speeds that Japanese fighters struggled to match even at lower altitudes. The Mustang's range capabilities were revolutionary. With two 110-gallon drop tanks, the P-51D could fly combat missions exceeding 1,600 miles, allowing round-trip sorties from Iwo Jima to any target in Japan. This extraordinary range was made possible by the Merlin engine's exceptional fuel efficiency, consuming just 65 gallons per hour at economical cruise settings, combined with the P-51's revolutionary laminar flow wing design that reduced drag by an unprecedented 35% compared to conventional airfoils. Standing in opposition to the American formations was the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, codenamed Frank by Allied intelligence, and considered by most aviation historians to be Japan's finest fighter aircraft of World War II. The Hayate represented everything Japanese engineers could achieve when given adequate resources and time, a fighter that could outperform the P-51D in several critical areas and stood as Japan's last hope for maintaining air superiority over the home islands. The Ki-84 was powered by the Nakajima Ha-45 Homare, an 18-cylinder radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower at takeoff when properly maintained and fueled with high-octane gasoline. In ideal conditions, the Hayate could achieve 427 miles per hour in level flight and climb at an astonishing 21.84 meters per second performance that exceeded the P-51D's capabilities in several key metrics. The aircraft's armament was formidable: two 20mm Ho-5 cannons and two 12.7mm machine guns provided devastating firepower that could destroy a B-29 with just a few well-placed hits. However, the gap between theoretical performance and battlefield reality had grown catastrophic by April 1945. Japan's industrial infrastructure, under constant attack by B-29 raids, could no longer maintain the quality control necessary for precision aircraft manufacturing. Many late-production Ki-84s suffered from poor build quality, using substitute materials and components that degraded performance and reliability. The complex Homare engine required skilled maintenance and high-octane fuel, both increasingly scarce commodities in a Japan under siege. The technical superiority of the P-51D extended far beyond raw performance figures to encompass every aspect of combat effectiveness. The aircraft's 6.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns fired at a combined rate of 4,800 rounds per minute, delivering 80 rounds per second of concentrated firepower. Each armor-piercing incendiary round weighed 46 grams and traveled at 2,900 feet per second, carrying sufficient kinetic energy to penetrate Japanese aircraft armor and ignite fuel systems with devastating effect. The ammunition capacity differential told the story of American industrial abundance versus Japanese scarcity. Each P-51D carried 1,880 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, enough for nearly 25 seconds of continuous firing. This generous ammunition load allowed American pilots to take ranging shots, engage multiple targets, and press attacks until completely successful. By contrast, the Ki-84's cannon carried only 150 rounds per gun, providing approximately 10 seconds of firing time before exhausting its most potent armament. The P-51D's cockpit ergonomics reflected 3 years of combat feedback and continuous refinement. The bubble canopy provided 360-degree visibility, allowing pilots to maintain situational awareness in the swirling confusion of air combat. The scale of American aircraft production in 1945 defied comprehension and demonstrated the fundamental difference between the world's two great industrial powers. North American aviation's factories were producing P-51Ds at a rate of 20 aircraft per day at peak production, rolling a completed fighter off the assembly line every 72 minutes around the clock. By April 1945, total P-51 production had reached 14,819 aircraft, with the D variant alone accounting for 8,156 airframes, more fighters than Japan produced of all types during the entire year of 1944. Each American aircraft was essentially identical to every other aircraft of the same variant, manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, and tested to exacting standards before delivery to operational units. Japanese production, by contrast, had devolved into controlled chaos. Total Ki-84 production reached just 3,514 aircraft by war's end, with individual aircraft varying significantly in performance and reliability, even within the same production batch. Quality control had collapsed under the pressure of constant bombing, material shortages, and the loss of skilled workers to military service. The pilots approaching Japan that April morning represented the most thoroughly trained aviators in the world. Major Moore had accumulated over 400 hours of flight time before reaching combat status, including extensive training in formation flying, instrument navigation, gunnery, and combat tactics. His training had included flights in captured German and Japanese aircraft, allowing American pilots to understand their opponent's capabilities and limitations intimately. The typical American pilot arriving at Iwo Jima had completed primary flight training, 60 hours, basic flight training, 75 hours, advanced training, 85 hours, and combat crew training, 100 hours, before deploying to a combat theatre. Gunnery training alone consumed 40 hours and thousands of rounds of ammunition, with pilots practicing deflection shooting against towed targets until hitting moving aircraft became second nature. Lieutenant William Bill Dunham, flying as Moore's wingman, exemplified this systematic approach to pilot development. The 22-year-old from Oregon had completed 324 hours of stateside training, including 47 hours of night flying, 23 hours of instrument flying, and 156 practice gunnery missions. He could navigate by dead reckoning across featureless ocean, maintain formation in weather that grounded commercial aircraft, and engage aerial targets with mechanical precision. The Japanese pilots, scrambling to intercept the incoming American formation, faced challenges that would have been unthinkable 18 months earlier. Flight Sergeant Hiroshi Nishizawa, climbing toward the Americans in his Ki-84, had received just 87 hours of total flight training, less than one-third the preparation time of his opponents. Fuel shortages had reduced his gunnery practice to fewer than 100 rounds fired in training, and he had never practiced interceptions against high-altitude targets. Warrant Officer Kenji Fujita, leading a three-plane Shotai formation from the 47th Sentai, represented Japan's pilot crisis in microcosm. At 19 years old, he had been commissioned directly from high school with minimal training. His total flight time in the Ki-84 amounted to just 34 hours, and this would be his first combat engagement against American fighters. The experienced pilots who might have taught him proper tactics were dead, killed in 3 years of attrition warfare across the Pacific. The psychological pressure on Japanese pilots had become crushing. Major Takeshi Yamamoto, the 47th Sentai's commanding officer, later wrote, "Our young pilots knew they were fighting a losing battle. They had been told that Japanese spirit would overcome American material advantages, but when they saw formations of 50 or 60 enemy fighters escorting hundreds of bombers, spirit seemed inadequate. Many accepted that they would not return from their missions. Their letters home were written as farewells." At 0847 hours, the first Japanese interceptors appeared as dark specks climbing from multiple airfields around Kyushu. Major Moore's formation maintained its westerly heading toward Kanoya Air Base, the Mustangs' polished aluminum surfaces gleaming in the morning sun as they crossed the coastline at 24,000 feet. Below them, Japanese radar operators tracked the impossible, American single-engine fighters operating over Japan with the casual confidence of aircraft on a training flight. The initial contact came when Flight Sergeant Nishizawa's Ki-84 closed to within 800 yards of the lead P-51 formation. The Japanese pilot had climbed at maximum power for 12 minutes, his home air engine running rough on 87-octane fuel and leaving a trail of black smoke that betrayed his position to every American pilot within 50 miles. As he maneuvered for an attack, his engine began missing badly, the result of poor quality fuel combined with an inadequately maintained cooling system. Major Moore spotted the climbing Japanese fighter and executed a combat turn that demonstrated the tactical sophistication of American air combat doctrine. Rather than engaging immediately, he led his flight in a wide turn that maintained altitude and energy while positioning his wingmen for mutual support. The maneuver had been practiced hundreds of times in training and executed with mechanical precision. "Bandits, 2 o'clock high," Moore radioed to his flight. "Bill, stay tight. We're going through them fast and clean." The engagement lasted approximately 40 seconds. Moore's flight dove through the Japanese formation with a 120 miles per hour speed advantage, each P-51 firing short, accurate bursts that set two Ki-84s ablaze and damaged a third. The Japanese pilots, caught in the middle of climbing to intercept, could not match the Americans' energy advantage or coordinated tactics. By the time they had turned to pursue, the Mustangs had already climbed back to 26,000 feet and reformed for their attack on Kanoya. The ground attack that followed demonstrated American air power at its most devastating. The 57 P-51Ds swept across Kanoya Air Base in multiple waves, their .50 caliber rounds shredding parked aircraft, fuel dumps, and maintenance facilities. In just 8 minutes, they destroyed 21 Japanese aircraft on the ground, damaged 15 others, and left the airfield's infrastructure in ruins. The psychological impact was even greater than the material damage. American fighters had struck deep into Japan and departed without loss, proving that the home islands were no longer sanctuary. The April 16th strike on Kanoya represented far more than a successful tactical mission. It marked the beginning of the end of organized Japanese air resistance. The ability to escort B-29s anywhere over Japan meant that precision daylight bombing could systematically destroy the remaining vestiges of Japanese industrial capacity. Aircraft factories that had survived night raids would now face repeated attacks by formations of hundreds of bombers protected by the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. The strategic implications rippled through Japanese military planning at every level. If American fighters could operate freely over Japan, then the homeland itself had become a battleground. The divine wind that was supposed to protect Japan from invasion had been conquered by American engineering and industrial might. Morale among Japanese pilots, already fragile after 3 years of losses, collapsed when they realized that their own skies were no longer safe. For Japanese civilians, the sight of American fighters conducting ground attacks in broad daylight shattered the last illusions about Japan's ability to defend itself. Radio Tokyo's claims of victory began to sound hollow when people could see enemy aircraft attacking targets with impunity. The psychological warfare value of the P-51 missions was enormous, demonstrating to both military and civilian populations that American victory was not just probable but inevitable. The success of the very long-range missions also validated American strategic planning and industrial mobilization. The ability to field hundreds of identical, high-performance aircraft supported by a supply chain stretching across the Pacific Ocean demonstrated the overwhelming advantages of a modern industrial economy at war. Every gallon of fuel, every round of ammunition, and every spare part represented American production capacity that Japan could not hope to match. By summer 1945, the numbers told the story of American dominance with mathematical precision. The 3 fighter groups operating from Iwo Jima could field 300 P-51Ds on any given day, with operational readiness rates consistently above 85%, despite harsh conditions and intensive combat operations. Each mission required approximately 60,000 gallons of high-octane fuel and 250,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition logistics support that arrived by ship and aircraft on schedule. Every day, Japanese air power had been reduced to statistical insignificance. The Ki-84 equipped units defending the home islands could muster fewer than 200 operational aircraft on their best days, and many of these were grounded for lack of fuel, ammunition, or qualified pilots. The 47th Sentai, which had started 1945 with 36 operational Ki-84s, could field only 8 aircraft by July. The 244th Sentai had been completely destroyed and reformed twice, each time with less experienced pilots and fewer resources. The production differential had become insurmountable. American factories delivered 98 new P-51Ds during the month of April alone, more than Japan produced Ki-84s during the entire second quarter of 1945. Quality control statistics revealed the fundamental difference. American aircraft had a mean time between failure of 247 flight hours, while Japanese aircraft averaged just 73 hours before requiring major maintenance or suffering catastrophic failure. Fuel consumption data illustrated the logistical miracle supporting American operations. Each very long-range mission from Iwo Jima consumed approximately 57,000 gallons of aviation gasoline for the fighter force alone. This represented just 3% of daily fuel deliveries to Pacific air bases. Japanese forces, meanwhile, had been reduced to extracting aviation fuel from pine trees and experimenting with alcohol-gasoline mixtures that destroyed engines and killed pilots. The shock experienced by Japanese pilots encountering P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo was more than tactical surprise. It was the stunning realization that American industrial capacity and technological sophistication had rendered Mustang geography meaningless. The Pacific Ocean, which had protected Japan for centuries, had been conquered by engineering excellence and manufacturing precision. Single-engine fighters flying 1,500-mile combat missions represented a revolution in warfare that changed the fundamental nature of military power. Flight Sergeant Nishizawa, who survived the April 16th engagement to fight until the war's end, wrote in his post-war memoir, "When I first saw those silver Mustangs over Kyushu, I understood that Japan had already lost the war, not because of their numbers, although they seemed endless, but because of what they represented. An enemy that could send fighters from islands we had never heard of to attack targets in Japan proper possessed resources we could not comprehend. We were fighting industrial capacity with courage, and courage alone was insufficient." The broader lesson of the P-51 missions over Japan transcended aviation to illuminate the nature of modern industrial warfare. Superior technology, multiplied by massive production capacity, created military advantages that traditional martial virtues could not overcome. The samurai spirit that had animated Japanese resistance for 3 years finally met its match in the production lines of Detroit and the oil fields of Texas. The P-51D Mustang specifications told the story in cold numbers. Engine: Packard V1657, producing 1,695 horsepower. Maximum speed: 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Service ceiling: 41,900 feet. Range: 1,650 miles with drop tanks. Armament: 6.50 caliber machine guns with 1,880 rounds. Production: 8,156 aircraft. The Ki-84 Hayate's specifications were equally impressive on paper. Engine: Nakajima Ha-45 Homare, producing 2,000 horsepower. Maximum speed: 427 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. Service ceiling: 34,450 feet. Range: 1,050 miles with drop tank. Armament: 2 20mm cannon with 300 rounds, 2 12.7mm machine guns with 350 rounds. Production: 3,514 aircraft. The contrast in surviving aircraft tells its own story. Hundreds of P-51 Mustangs survive in museums and private collections worldwide, many still airworthy, and demonstrating their engineering excellence at air shows decades after the war's end. Only one Ki-84 Hayate remains in existence, displayed at the Chiran Peace Museum in Kagoshima, Japan, a lone testament to Japan's desperate attempt to match American technological and industrial superiority. The P-51D Mustang over Tokyo was not merely an aircraft, it was the embodiment of American industrial triumph, technological innovation, and the inexorable mathematics of modern warfare. The Japanese pilots who faced them learned the hardest lesson of the 20th century, that in industrial war, superior engineering and manufacturing capacity would ultimately prevail over individual courage and traditional military virtues. The shock of American fighters over Tokyo was the shock of mathematical inevitability, the realization that Japan's fate had been sealed not in the skies above the Pacific, but in the factories and research laboratories of a nation that had mastered the science of modern warfare. The divine wind had been conquered by the slide rule, the katana overcome by the production line, and the warrior tradition defeated by the relentless logic of industrial supremacy. As Major Moore banked his Mustang toward home after the successful strike, he could see the smoke from Kanoya Air Base rising behind him like a funeral pyre for Japanese air power. The mission had lasted 7 hours and 43 minutes, covered 1,387 miles, and demonstrated beyond doubt that American fighters could reach any target in Japan and return safely to base. The age of the Pacific as a protective barrier had ended, replaced by an age where American industrial might could project power anywhere on Earth. The ultimate irony was that Japan's finest fighter aircraft, the Ki-84 Hayate, was actually superior to the P-51D in several performance categories. In the hands of experienced pilots with adequate fuel and maintenance support, the Hayate could outclimb, outturn, and outgun the American fighter. But by April 1945, Japan lacked experienced pilots, adequate fuel, proper maintenance, and most critically, the industrial capacity to produce enough aircraft to matter. The Ki-84's theoretical advantages were meaningless when only a handful could be fielded against hundreds of P-51s. This was the true lesson of the P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo, that wars are won not by the best individual weapons, but by the nation that can design, produce, deploy, and support the most effective military systems at scale. American victory was assured not by the superiority of any single aircraft, but by the ability to mass-produce excellent aircraft faster than the enemy could destroy them, supported by logistics networks that spanned oceans and training programs that produced skilled pilots by the thousands. The shock of Japanese pilots encountering P-51 Mustangs in broad daylight over their homeland was the shock of recognizing that they were not just fighting American pilots, but American industry had won the war before the first shot was fired. In the end, only mathematics mattered. 15,586 P-51s of all variants produced versus 3,514 Ki-84s, 20 American fighters rolling off production lines daily versus Japan's total monthly output, 1,880 rounds of ammunition per P-51 versus 400 rounds per Ki-84, 85% operational readiness rates versus 40%. The numbers told the story that no amount of Bushido could rewrite. The P-51D Mustang over Mount Fuji represented more than air superiority. It represented the triumph of scientific management, industrial capacity, and systematic excellence over traditional military virtues. The samurai had met the assembly line, and the assembly line had won.